All right. So my slides are very short and quick. Basically giving a little bit of an introduction as to who I am. So I was a founding member of the InnerSource Commons way back with Denise, and I actually got to attend the very first meeting that she ever held. And I was also previously a board member, and currently I'm the treasurer. Then I was also the director of InnerSource at PayPal under Denise Cooper, and currently I am the president of Leading Bit Solutions, and I'm also the executive director of IEEE SA Open's new open source project that they've been working on. So why did I create the booklet? Well, I'm a person who likes to be very organized, and I kind of live off of my checklists. And so I had created all of these different ones that I was using while I was, doing this the very first year at PayPal. I ended up doing this for 3 years, but this was basically right at the beginning. And so I took all those different notes. I have so many things that I would like to add to it, but time and things of that nature, I wasn't able to. But that's why I wanted to publish it, was just kind of like immediately making it available to everyone to be able to sit there and see some of the different things that we were doing and how we were doing it. Some things that I think I could add to it just right now from today would be more about DevSecOps, doing the different developer operations and security and things of that nature. I've been doing a lot of stuff in regards to infrastructure as code and things of that nature. One of the things that we did at the last year I was at PayPal was adding an enterprise search, which was super useful for doing that part that he was just talking about in regards to the passive documentation. By doing enterprise search, what we did is we grabbed GitHub, Enterprise, and Slack, and Confluence, and Jira, and Rally, and 4 other internal PayPal-only tools, and put them all into one H-based database, and then allowed people to search it, which was pretty awesome because I set it up so that other business units across PayPal, as you know, PayPal owns a lot of other companies, were able to replicate their data into search, and other people could find it without forcing people to change all of their tooling and change everything the way that they were doing it, by creating something that was very open and API centric. We could pool all the resources together and find out what everyone was doing. And also from that, I was starting to create some better KPI reporting models for that. So you could sit there and see, oh, here's what Braintree and Venmo are doing, as well as what PayPal is doing, and things of that nature. The other thing that we also did in the final year was redid the orchestration tooling for PayPal.com, which was basically all the way from the initial ideation, the creative aspect of it, all the way to deployment online for PayPal. It was about 90 steps, as you can imagine. Don't want PayPal.com going down. But by going through and redoing that and doing it InnerSource style, we were able to get some very major features done in a very tight time frame, where after making everything very API centric, we were able to do things like CI/CD in less than a year, and database as a service and things of that nature. So that was very good. Also going in and introducing, going through those orchestration tooling, realizing all the other things that we could add in regards to maturity, for things like safety, quality, and security, which I feel is something that we need to do more work on sometimes in open source as well, or that work is done at a company, but not necessarily part of the open source process. And so it's kind of like one of those outside in things where open source has this really good thing, but so does corporations. Corporations has some things that they do very well. And I know many Japanese companies who do this part very, very well. And how do we actually introduce that back into open source too, to make open source also better? And then also, especially with the work that I'm doing now, a lot in regards to open standards. In fact, I've been working on something called the Good Governance Initiative with the OSPO Alliance, which is the Open Source Program Office Alliance, and bringing some of that in more. And I think with some of that, it would be easier to address some of the international business unit issues and reporting that we were trying to address previously for the other work that I was doing. And then I introduced this because of my conversations with Yuki on what we could add tomorrow and some of the other different tools and aspects that I think would be really important. And so that would be different things like some of the AI tools, because earlier, I talked about the monitoring portions of it. But I think that there's more that you can do in regards to that. And by inner sourcing it, you could better address some of those privacy issues by using the open source tools and techniques, but also doing, like I talked about with enterprise search, that isn't something that a company wants to have public to everyone for very obvious reasons. And I think that there's ways of doing the segmentation of that so that you don't accidentally violate some of those rules that are out there, like GDPR and things of that nature. And then also through that, I think there's a lot of different, very interesting things that you could do ahead of time in regards to mergers and acquisitions across all of those different business units to do that safer, do that more safely. So, and then lastly, thank you so much for having me here. And I'm also a bit floored that this has all happened. I certainly wasn't expecting it. And for the people who have done the translations, um, thank you so much. I worry a little bit about so much of my writing is based off of stories and colloquialisms that might have been hard, I think, to translate occasionally. Looking back at the book and sitting there saying things like "Mikasa is Sukasa" is I'm from Texas, and there's a lot of my husband is part Hispanic, and so there's a lot of things that are cultural. And one of those things is it's a frequent saying that comes from Mexico. My house is your house, and by addressing it that way was kind of like my way of expressing that. And so I hope some of those things are able to come across in the translations that y'all did. And so thank you so much for being patient and working through all of that. So thank you.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Yeah, thank you for writing the amazing inner source documentation and book actually. So now let's move on next interview session. Actually, we have a bunch of questions and topics actually. So I will share my screen. So actually, we created a list of topics and items what we want to have a conversation today. But actually, for this session, we wanted to make it more interactive and exciting. So feel free to ask anything on chat, or maybe you can interrupt your this session and ask your question about to Silona. And actually, each slide will display keywords to guide the conversation. But please note that we won't be able to cover everything in detail. Again, the slide serve as an anchor to guide the conversation. So we have several topics. First one is there now. The last one in the future. I saw interesting items on Silona's slides. For instance, the additional items for future InnerSource checklist, for instance, DevSecOps or maybe AI. And also, the purpose of why we invite Silona, the speaker, is to solve Japanese companies' maybe problems. So how the Japanese culture can be changed to make InnerSource work, or maybe how to adopt InnerSource in country where large companies are lagging behind in in-house development. Or maybe our Japanese company have constraints for when it comes to adopting InnerSource, for instance, management, accounting, and tax processing. I'm sure that Silona is not a accounting professional and tax professional, but I believe that Silona witnessed so many things around these kind of topics. So maybe it's worth asking these kind of questions. So first topic is about there now. So actually, this book was published like 6 years ago, but a lot has happened in 6 years. InnerSource Commons has grown and various case studies have emerged. Compared to when you started InnerSource, it's much easier to start now. So how have InnerSourcing changed? Or why do we need InnerSourcing now? Or could you share some thoughts on it?
So I think one of the big things is like realizing the impact of just open source now. And basically, it's almost impossible to do anything without having open source being part of your code base at this point. And now, especially with things like CodePilot coming into play and all of those other different ones, basically by doing something like Copilot, Microsoft has kind of taken the whole way that open source is done and how open source is coded and made it the norm. And you know, so basically, if you've gone through and you've done any open source work or you've done anything along those lines, unintentionally, you've trained Microsoft's Copilot. So there's a big thing that's happening there in regards to where that's going, and I think that that has a big influence on something like InnerSource, because you know so much of it is us taking the open source way of doing things and bringing it to an internally public corporate level. And so that I think will continue to be true. I think one of the things that's changed for me since then is there's been a lot of what I call inside out in regards to that, because I keep doing open source and I go over to InnerSource and I do that and then I bring it back to open source and I go back and forth between those two different worlds. And for example, one of the things that I thought that I believe InnerSource really taught me at PayPal was we were doing it. And Denise did one project before I got there that was extremely successful, but then it didn't catch to the rest of the company. And one of the things that I did that really helped it catch and spread to the rest of the company is I trained over about 1,200 middle managers in regards to what InnerSource and open source was. And then once I did that, the fear, a lot of people were very afraid of open source. And by going through and doing that whole training, many people became less afraid and in fact embraced it, especially since we had the CEO talking about one team. That was a big thing, was one team. And it was something that management started to be measured on, as if they were doing things that were one team. And one of the major things was InnerSourcing, because it was a way of breaking down all of those different barriers. And so once they understood what InnerSource was and how to do it, many barriers were broken down. Well, I took that learning about middle management and brought it back to open source, because oftentimes with open source, it was just the developers and, oh, we don't need anything else. Well, one problem with open source is it's very good with creating tools that are developer to developer. Those are fine. Those do well, like Kubernetes and Linux and things of that nature. But when it comes to talking to the users who aren't developers, if they don't have all of those different normal corporate constructs, it's not so great. A lot of those tools have bad user interfaces or have poor design or don't consider all of those different constructs. So one of the things that I've done since then, especially like when I went over to Hyperledger, for example, which was the last time I was in Japan, was for the Hyperledger Membership Summit. One of the things that I did with them is I actually brought Confluence and Jira over and bringing some of the different stuff from InnerSource over into Hyperledger, so that there was more acknowledgement of all of these other types of contributions. In fact, one of the really big ones that happened was the Chinese translations. There was a big conflict between, well, it wasn't a conflict because there wasn't strife. There was just a complete lack of knowledge of what the Chinese group was doing versus, you know, a lot of the European American groups were doing. And so they thought that they weren't doing anything. I said, oh, no, you have to go look. Their GitHub, they're coding all over the place. But the problem is because of the time zone difference and the language barrier, they weren't meeting. And as soon as I changed our wiki, I created a wiki and changed over to Confluence and made it so that we could have multiple languages. They just ripped through it, translating it. Just like there were 50, and they actually created little leaderboards in WeChat where it's like, and they just translated everything. And then it started a very big acceleration in regards to the Chinese coders being able to contribute to a bunch of other different projects, because once that barrier was just knocked down, it really accelerated. And that was like one of the things that I learned from being at PayPal, and sat there and said, oh, these are the ways that you can open this up so that these different groups can come in. And also through marketing, which is, I think, an often neglected group in open source. Once again, at Hyperledger, I saw, oh, wait a second, we have a Stack Overflow group with over 2,000 people on it doing 150 messages a day that nobody realized we had either, because we hadn't gone and done the OSINT, the open source intelligence research. And so by bringing that in, taking the marketing, doing a marketing technique on a thing that wasn't very well known yet, which was the OSINT, the open source marketing intelligence, going through and doing that, I was then able to highlight all of those things as well. And so I feel like there's a big back and forth that can occur between InnerSource and open source, and taking the learnings in different directions. And so I think that would be one thing that I would highlight in regards to that. And then, of course, open source itself is constantly evolving too. And that needs to be brought back into InnerSource as well. And so that's why I mentioned DevSecOps, because my company, we've been doing a lot with infrastructure as code and containerization and things of that nature. And there is so much that different corporations can benefit from knowing and understanding that, even if you don't release it as open source or have to release it externally. But if you do have a large multinational company with many different business units, that's a good way of doing things like privacy and security and safety and quality measurements and things of those natures, is by going through and doing that. So I think that that's all very important for doing that. And like I said, there's been so much that's happened in regards to enterprise search. And I feel like a lot of the stuff that's happened with AI is kind of a reflection of that type of data gathering that's been done. And I think sometimes it's a bit dangerous with some of the AI that we haven't paid more attention to where the data is coming from and things of that nature. And that's where we have the privacy issues that start to occur. And so I think that there's some stuff there that can be done as well. And I think that's honestly some of the stuff that I see, once again, InnerSourcing being able to probably do and then release to the open source world, is understanding, oh, we need to do some segmentation of that. We need to understand the privacy concerns of this. How do we sit there and take some of these other greater learnings and add in the needs that we have on an enterprise level for when we're doing what I always like to call internally public, which is, enterprise only. So, yeah. There's so many different case studies that have emerged at this point. Denise did another book that I'm sure y'all have seen. That there's a lot that's going on there. I think the challenges that people face are honestly some of the same ones I've seen this entire time. Is we've known in many ways better ways of running businesses, but it's still always hard to get people to do those things, to do some of the basics that they really need to do. And I feel like that's like still the main challenges that I see companies facing, has to do with, being better about product management, being better about how you treat or hire your employees, things of that nature. So, yeah, any other questions?
Yeah, sure. How do you think that InnerSource is going to be treated in these economic circumstances? I mean, so many big tech started layoff, and then there are several important investment area for those kind of company. But sometimes I witnessed some of the InnerSource department was cut due to the recession. Or InnerSource, do you think InnerSource is still the higher, higher priority, or maybe if
I
there's
think
still another? Yeah, sure.
I think when people cut it, they do it out of ignorance, because I don't see InnerSource being any different from any other type of change management. In fact, I see it as being a fundamental change management type of thing. And I feel like oftentimes companies during a recession get a bit myopic in regards to that. And they don't understand that what InnerSource is doing is not anything external, honestly. It's not like open source. It's not like you have to sit down and figure out how you're going to contribute back to the open source project or do any of those additional costs. All the costs that you're doing are honestly your own, and they're ones that you should be doing anyhow. And if you're not doing them, I would question the stock value of any company who sits there and says, oh, we don't need product management. We don't need program management. We don't need any of those things, because that's the same thing that you're doing when you sit there and say, we don't need InnerSource, or we don't need these different things, is you're not considering the larger aspects of what it means to run your company and run your company effectively. So that's kind of my reaction to a lot of that, and it made me very sad to watch a lot of those layoffs happen, of those things like the open source program offices, where for some of them, like, okay, so you did that, now what happens to your legal liability? It's like, have you been, one of the major reasons that, a lot of people, a lot of companies and a lot of different groups launched open source program offices at the very beginning had to do with legal liability. And getting rid of it, I'm just like, so you think you're okay now? you know, might not be. So you should be watching some of those different things, and also sitting there going, it, I think it's very short-sighted. I think doing that is very short-sighted in regards to understanding the longevity of your business. And so I question any of those that are doing that. I know a little bit too much about what's happening with some of that. There's this thing called activist investors, and they're one of the big pushes behind some of those layoffs that are happening. I don't know if you've done much research in it. Wired actually had a pretty good article about it. And they also went after DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Harvard Business Review has been releasing studies on diversity and inclusion, showing definitively on many studies over the past 20 years that diversity increases your profit margin, plain and simple. And if you don't do it, you're not going to increase that profit margin. So getting rid of things like OSPOs and InnerSource programs and DEI is going to do nothing but once again hurt your bottom line. So I think it's a poor judgment call. It's just like they also do things like get rid of their technical writers too. And it's like, seriously, who cares about documentation? That's horrible. You're gonna need that.
Yeah.
It's a very problematic thing to do. I think instead you should look at your path of innovation and acceleration, and is it a sustainable one, is a more valid way of going through and looking at those things, and also figuring out what is it that you're doing that you really shouldn't be doing. Because a lot of times companies pivot and waste and create a lot of different products that may not be the products that they need to be producing. I think a lot of times it's better to, what is it, and when you're building, measure twice, cut once, is more of my philosophy in regards to that. And I feel like oftentimes companies, when they're doing these kind of things, they're not doing that. They're not measuring twice and cutting once. They're just cutting.
Sure. So when it comes to so when it comes to recession, Japan is in a kind of similar situation, because Japanese economy is kind of shrinking, and so Japanese companies are struggling to grow their business. So then next topic is how the Japanese culture can be changed to make InnerSource work. Maybe some of the culture may fit to InnerSource. For instance, company loyalty, emphasis on etiquette and manners, so maybe traditional skills and craftsmanship, maybe emphasis on harmony. But maybe there's some characteristic it doesn't work for. So sometimes, for instance, seniority-based promotion and pay, whereas it's important to have a merit-based organization in InnerSource, or maybe detailed rules and manuals and indirect communications. So what's your take?
Yeah, so looking at some of these, and of course, I'm not an expert on Japanese culture, so be patient with me. But I think one of the things that we do is we don't have emphasis on etiquette and manners, and I'm sure y'all saw that when you were translating the book. Is a lot of times one way that I get people to be nicer to each other is by reminding them that things are public. And that ends up being very helpful to people being nicer than they were previously. I also did some competitions to actually help that, to encourage it. So I think honestly, bringing in the Japanese culture on that could be a benefit to us. Because then everyone would be nicer and the communications would often be easier for that reason. And I think the other one that does really translate well is, as you said, the traditional skills and craftsmanship. That's one of the things that I just adore about the Japanese culture is that, and also like visiting Japan and working with different people from there, the fact that everyone is always trying to do their best, I think is really amazing and important. And I think it translates well to open source too, because one reason I find that people first off don't want to adopt open source or inner source is because of the fact that they're like, oh, my stuff is not very good. And but if they do believe that their stuff is good and that they have been doing such a good doing that, then they're more likely to be able to share it and not worry as much. Though maybe sometimes it might not be considered as humble to do that. So that maybe that might be a barrier. I'm not sure. But group orientation, I think, is also very good in regards to that. But like you said, in regards to the seniority, that's normally not a thing that translates well, in that it is very much so more about, and sometimes I fight a little bit against the meritocracy, because too often with the meritocracy, they do things what I call lazy data, lazy metrics, where it's like, oh, everything is off of GitHub. And I'm like, not everything occurs in GitHub, or in GitLab, or, a Bitbucket or whatever tool you're using. I'm like, there's also marketing, there's also events, there's also documentation, there's websites, there's all these other things that happen to really bring a community together, and it's not just the code. And so if you're going to do those different things, you need to look beyond that. And so that might be a problem. For rules and manuals, one of the things that I'm learning working in the standards group is how to do those things well so that they age well, right? Because one problem that sometimes we have is we create rules and the rules aren't created correctly. You should never like sit there and say you must do these things, because then you can limit innovation and you can limit creativity and you can limit implementations of it. Instead, you should go for, a rule that's broader in its interpretations, where you should look at it in regards to your goals, not so much in regards to you must do it this way. There's like a funny story about this woman who always would cook a roast, and she'd always chop off both ends of the roast. And she thought, okay, well, this is how my mom did it. And this is how, and my mom and her mom's, well, this is how grandma did it. And then they find out that the reason grandma did that is because that would make sure that it would fit in the oven. It didn't need to have the ends chopped off. But because people didn't understand why the ends were chopped off, they, kept doing it even though it didn't need to be done. Instead, it was like, oh, make sure that it fits, or make sure that, things of that nature. And we need to do those same kinds of rules and procedures in our software as well, where we understand what those final goals are, not necessarily what the actual procedure of it needs to be. Indirect communication. Yeah, that's a tough one. Because it's that's so ingrained. I was talking to one of my friends about the Japanese language, and I loved that we could sit there and she and I talk in a very different way than most English speakers. And she's very good at Japanese. I'm not. And one of our friends was like listening in on one of our conversations. They're like, "How do you actually know what's being said?" It's so indirect what you're saying. And I'm like, because we know each other so well. But then we knew that other people couldn't listen in onto us and know what we were talking about, which I think is, an amazing thing about about the language, because that's where, she's like, oh yeah, this is like Japanese. And when we speak like this, we're actually speaking in this certain way. And I was like, I didn't know that. And so I think it's got some beautiful things in there, but it's also got some difficult aspects in regards to, making sure that you actually are accurate and things of that nature. And so, but honestly, with what's happening with AI, it might be giving y'all an advantage. I'm just saying. That might be a really good advantage here coming up pretty soon. Is the ability to do that in Japanese. So, yeah, I think the thing on that is a lot of times I don't know if you need to actually have direct criticism or you need to have those different aspects. I think, going back to what I said earlier about the rules and procedures, if you address it correctly and and it's, we talk about this a lot in in management about using certain types of language so that you don't blame people. Instead, and this is something that's new in the States, but instead you focus on the thing that's not working, not anything having to do with the person or things of that nature. Then it actually ends up being a plus rather than a minus. So, bringing that clarity in, I think it could be really good. With reputation, that's hard because you do need to be able to fail. And failing publicly is part of the game. And so that I think it will be a very, very hard thing to do, is to get past that. And to be quite honest, everybody I know hates failing publicly. I think that's human nature, and it is something that you do have to kind of get past. So for me, I've purposely done some things where I've purposely failed publicly to force people into things. Like I went and I did this one crazy wiki, and I didn't correct any of, I'm typing fast. I didn't correct any of my misspellings, any of my grammar, any of it. And I found that it was the easiest gateway to get people to come in and fix things on the wiki the very first time, because they were afraid of it and they didn't know what to do. But they're like, oh, Silona did this. Oh, I don't want her to be, I don't want people to think she's stupid. I'm going to go in. I'm going to go fix it for her. And it was great because suddenly a whole bunch of people got on there. They fixed everything. And I was just like, and then once they did that one fix, it was so much easier to come in and do the bigger, harder fixes, that were more risky and things of that nature. So I think it's important to bring that in. I think that the avoidance of confrontation is a good thing. I think it's really important to look for consensus and to figure out where that central point's going to be, where everybody can be 80% happy. And I think that actually has a lot of value. I think a lot of communities at the beginning have to get in there and learn that more. I think it is important when you're doing that, just to do that abstraction again, where it's not about the person, it's about the actual thing, and staying focused on that, I think, is a very crucial piece of it. So,
yeah,
yeah,
it's actually a great insight for us. Maybe you made a mistake first, and then yeah. So actually, our Japanese community is very relatively small right now, but yeah, there's so many professional when it comes to adopting an InnerSource, and then they are facing not only cultural challenges, but also the company rules and then maybe management accounting rules problems. So I will go ahead to the next topic about management accounting and tax processing. As I said that Yeah, I'd like to be a little short on this one because I'm not a professional on accounting stuff. But yeah, I want to know your insights on it.
Yeah, so with a lot of it, it's kind of funniest in regards to how some of this ends up happening because one thing that's interesting and that you have to be a little bit careful of is like when I talked about enterprise search at PayPal, right? So by going in and bringing, you heard all those databases I talked about, right? You bring in all of those in. I said I basically broke a German privacy rule by doing that because I am spying on employees because the only thing I didn't have was, private DMs and email. And so from doing that, I know what you're doing all day long. I can sit there and see that you're chatting with different groups over here. I can see that, you're writing some documentation here. I can see that you're doing your project management here. I can see that you're coding over here. It's like I have all of the information. And one of the things that can happen with that is you can actually go in and really understand where the work is happening and when it's happening and things of that nature. One thing that ends up being a little bit weird on the tax and accounting regulations is similar to the problems that I had at Hyperledger with export control, where they don't, you have to be careful on certain ones because, like for example, one of the projects that I had was written almost entirely by Huawei. And of course, we all know some of the political stuff that some of the different stuff that's happened in regards to that. And so they were very worried about it. And I sat there and I said, well, let's do a code, let's do the basically, we called them boot camps, but they're kind of like codeathons, where I had a bunch of different people from different companies in different countries all come in and contribute to that code base. And then suddenly it's like, now it's international and it's open source. So now these things don't apply. That's not true here, right? Because it's InnerSource. And so we do have to figure out where each of those things are and where they come from. But by having all of those different tools and making sure that they're internally transparent, you can get to all of that data if you're allowed to structure them correctly. And I think that's the hardest part, is coming in and having those discussions with accounting, with all of the different departments to sit there and say, here's the actual pieces. I think that's one reason why one of the things that I included in that was that KPI management aspect. And so when you have something like the search part where you have all the different pieces and you have the different KPIs and you have all the different dashboards and things of that nature, then you can get past some of these constraints that you're talking about. But I think the hard part with that is coming in and doing that work with those different departments to allow that to take place and to happen. So, questions? I think you're muted, Yuki.
Sure, sorry. How did you kick off your conversation inside the company? Or you must have so many stakeholders inside the company, and then you need to tie you need to start a bunch of conversation with a bunch of people. So how did you do that?
So the funny thing is, I actually became well known for my tea parties because I'm a huge tea drinker. And I created some different ones around some of those different topics. Like, for example, on the orchestration tooling, we had something called FDI, which is Failed Developer Interactions Monitoring, that I was also in charge of. And when we've started deciding what is a failed developer interaction, I actually created a committee of lead developers from each of the VPs for each of the different business units, and we would get together, have tea, and discuss what those things were and what we all thought that they would be, and came to a consensus in regards to that. And so I've done various things similar to that. There's also a lot of reporting up in regards to those KPIs to the C-level management. So talking with the CTO, and the CEO and some of the other different people on that level about here's what we're doing, here's how we're doing it. And that way we're able to get better buy-in from some of the other departments that I didn't normally interact with me previously, like financial, where they could actually understand, oh, this is what we're doing in regards to that. And similarly, in regards to compliance, there were a few things that were not InnerSourced for compliance reasons. where it's like, okay, we're not actually going to, 97% of the code was in this GitHub Enterprise that everybody could see, but there was a small percentage of the code that was not. And that was for compliance reasons, and that's fine. And then also with doing the enterprise search for compliance with GDPR and some of the German regulations, there were some things that weren't allowed to be done. And it's the similar stuff that you're going to probably end up seeing in AI as well. But there's going to be things that do need to be restricted in regards to that.
Or next, maybe attendees may have a question on how you do that in PayPal in detail, maybe. But yeah, maybe I will ask them later. Then, so next theme is about InnerSource future. You mentioned about yeah, AI, and recent generative AI hype is great and amazing. So tools like GitHub Copilot are becoming popular. There is also a future where apps can be created with no code, just prompts. So, but I think the part where humans have to write code is definitely going to remain, but the focus area and the collaboration will change maybe. So GitHub Copilot will have feature like a Copilot for pull requests in the future, so it will be more common to develop with AI bots. So what do you think on emerging AI technologies, and how do you relate it to InnerSource?
So I think one thing to always recognize about the AI and what we're doing. So I've been involved in AI for off and on for a very long time. I did some peripheral work on some stuff back in the early 90s in regards to clean coal, doing having these different sensors and throughout the coal plant and being able to optimize for them to get to a, from 80% efficiency to 99.99% efficiency. And how did we do that? Well, we had a really good training set, and that training set was based off of chemistry. So we knew what the known good was, right? Because it's science, and we were able to go in there and do that. And I think we're going to run into something very similar with AI. Is that for a lot of the different stuff that we're doing and what we're doing, how we're doing it, and things of that nature, there isn't necessarily a known good. In fact, there's not a known good for us either as humans. We constantly change, we constantly evolve. Language is constantly changing. What certain words mean change frequently, all of the time. New words come into play, things of that nature. And so the computer doesn't come up with those. We do. And I think that's the biggest thing to understand in regards to it. And when it comes to, replacing programmers, I worry about this a lot, but then I've been worrying about the state of programming for a while because I learned how to program very early on. And when I was going through and doing my different optimizations for things like databases and things of that nature, I was able to do really good optimizations and do really large scale systems and do all that because I actually understood how the hard drives worked. I actually understood how each of those different things and what they were doing. And so therefore I was able to be very advanced in regards to doing that. And the more and more that we abstract away, the more and more I worry that we're going to lose the ability to do these things well if we keep going in that direction, and we're going to only have a few subset of people who really do know and understand that. I supported a lot of the maker movement for that reason, because I was like, oh, now that we've got all these little bitty IoT and wearable things and everything, everyone has to go back and learn some C programming again so that they actually do understand how the computer is working on that, little bitty thing and stuff of that nature, so that when it translates to the larger systems, they actually do know the basics before they go in there and start creating. And so I do worry about that, that we will still need to train and we will still need to do all that. And I think in regards to that, InnerSource, I think, is uniquely positioned because of the fact that, like, with Copilot from GitHub and things of that nature, is, is that completely okay that they did that, right? So there's all these open source developers who are not pro Microsoft, who have basically gone through and created this model that Microsoft now profits off of. So they took them and all of their skills and put it all together and then went in and did that. Is that okay? Is that appropriate? Is it ethical? What does that do to things like open source? Well, it could devastate open source, right? A whole bunch of people go, oh, well, we're not going to release that now because now we know you're going to go in and harvest, and harvest what, we've basically grown. And for a lot of that, especially with InnerSource, I can see there being a lot of these other derivative models that start to occur, where you might learn, where like Google might go and train one just internally to learn how to code the Google way, which, by the way, they've kind of been doing already with people. Google's had for quite some time their own internal checking mechanism to make sure that everybody is adhering to the way that Google likes their code to be structured. Have you structured your code in this way? Does it look like this? Is it readable in all of these different ways? And had already these other mechanisms that were checking things of that nature. And I feel that some of that might start occurring more so. And I think that will start happening in inner sourcing, where people will have those other different things and sit there and train, their own version of it so that people can do things in the way that they would like to see it done. And I think that's the same for the code and quality analysis, is that, like I said, Google's had one for quite some time, where they do go through a lot of that checking. I think there's going to be more of that in regards to testing as well, doing your different types of code tests. I think that's one of the, I'm hoping, since I hate writing it, that's going to be the best uses of AI. Is writing all of your tests, both your usability and functional ones. I'm hoping that it'll be better at doing some of the other testing in regards to that. Some of the other tests are kind of, stupid anyhow, but like going through and doing the usability test, it might be able to tell you more about if those are actually working correctly or not. So yeah, I think that there's a lot that's happening in regards to that. I know that I've been using it myself, where I'm doing some different things on, my team's been using it for some of their CI/CD and infrastructure as code creation, where, we've been using the AI to help it. Of course, one of the things that happens with a lot of that is, all of the AI right now are just basically interns, right? They're not, I wouldn't trust any of their code. But as someone who used to teach programming, it's been great for me because I'm good at debugging, and I'm good at looking at things going, oh, this isn't going to work, this is what's going to work. And so it's made me a lot faster. I think it's going to do that for a lot of other people. I don't think it's going to get rid of it, because, even like talking about like the paintings that people are doing, stepping out of the code, the computer's not going to come up with a Van Gogh style. It's just not one of the things that the computer's going to come up with. The computer is really good at mimicking a Van Gogh style, but it's not going to come up with it. And I think that's the thing that we need to remember in regards to our coding, is that the computer's not going to come up with that piece. It's going to be good at mimicking it. It's, the parrot metaphor I've been hearing a lot, though parrots are smarter than you think. But it is more along those lines. Is that it's not going to come up with it originally, but it can reflect it back to you, and it can reflect it back to you, oftentimes in the correct context. And so we need to remember that piece on all this, especially when it comes to the fact that, we're starting to enter into quantum, and that's a whole nother way of coding as well. And it's going to need to come from us first, not from the AI. The AI has to learn from us. And so I think that's going to be the biggest thing that has to happen. With InnerSource, I do worry about the fragmentation, because we do need to keep our segmentation, like with the Samsung thing where people uploaded things that they really shouldn't have uploaded. I think that's going to be something that people become a lot more conscious of, and that is going to inhibit some of those training models. And I think we are going to be looking instead in regards to how do we create those internal models as well. And so I think that's a big piece for InnerSource. Because imagine if you are a big company and you are able to harness, 5,000 developers at PayPal, or 130,000 developers at Bosch, or each of those different ones, you can come up with some pretty amazing models for yourself internally that you might not want to share.
Yeah, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you. Those are the questions we prepared in advance, actually. So very good insight, actually. Yeah, it was so helpful for our inner source practitioners in Japan, I think. Yeah, thank you very much. So we still have another 20 minutes, so I'd like to move on the QA session. Andはい、日本語でも質問とか別に今回のセッションに関わらなくてもいいので、ちょっとなんか聞いてみたいとか、全然ベーシックなことでも良いので、ちょっと書いていただければ拾いますし、そのまま言っていただいても良いので、そうですね、ちょっと QA セッションに移りたいと思います。はい。で、多分マッサンとかもあるんじゃないかなと思いますが、ちょっと皆さんが質問を考えている間に、私が1個だけちょっと追加の質問をしていきたいと思います。はい、じゃあちょっと皆さん質問も考えつつ、ですね、セッションに移りたいと思います。So actually, yeah, so the question can be Japanese, so I will pick some Japanese question and then translate it into English and ask you a question maybe. So while everyone is thinking, I will ask one question about accounting taxation. Yeah, sorry for that. You are not a professional in this area, but yeah, everyone in Japan who wants to practice, who want to introduce InnerSource into their organization, afraid of profit sharing, additional taxation, and it's going to be a hurdle to share the knowledge inside the community. So I'd like to hear how you have sorted out the accounting scheme. For example, you could consolidate all the codes into headquarters and simplify the communication with so many legal entity, for instance. So I'd like to know how you sort it out.
So I think what happened with some of our stuff is the ownership of it became very clear when you do look at the different contributions that are made, like through doing something like the enterprise search, where you can sit there and see, okay, here, for example, one of the first big projects that I worked on was the payment core. So one of the first things that happened is I inherited the fact that payment core and PayPal hadn't been refactored in almost 12 years. And what happened is by doing this whole different one, I found that there had been like 5 different major departments in PayPal that had kept, like, what would happen is one department would come over, be in control of it, they would start to change things, and then that vice president would fall out of favor, and then it would go over to another vice president. And they would be like, oh no, I really care about this, and then they would start to change it. And so nothing ever really got finished because they all had such big plans in regards to that. And one of the things that I helped facilitate was actually breaking that code base up into 5 different major pieces for each of those different departments and talking about the interoperability of each of those. And by going through and doing that, then each of them were able to have what they needed and what they needed to have control over, and at the same time work with each other. In fact, I knew I'd done well when I sat there and I looked and I was uninvited from all of these different meetings. And I was like, hey guys, why have you uninvited me? And they're like, oh, we get along good now. We don't need you there. And I said, I'm still the director of InnerSource. I have to measure all the different work that you're doing. I said, I'm not there just for facilitation. I'm actually here for these other things. And now that we're dividing it out and we're doing all that, I still need to be there to measure it and sit there and say, oh no, this was effective and this is why it was effective. And they're like, oh, right. And so they invited me back into it. But one of the things that we did was we did measure that as we were going through in regards to the partitioning that was happening. And there was still a little bit of, swords coming out, with the VPs, because they were like, oh, but this is, where they didn't, where they were a little bit afraid of, like counting lines of code, for example, where that wasn't a very good thing, because then it's like, well, I have so many lines of code, but they have, it's the same thing that people do in regards to measuring direct reports. I have so many direct reports, so therefore I am more important than so-and-so who only has so many direct reports. And it's like, well, are you doing the thing that brings in all the money or not? And so I think that ends up where, those kind of things come into play. And so in the end, the accounting actually has to make some of those decisions in regards to what are the values of each of those different things, because there can be things that don't take up very much code, but do actually create, much more money than some of the other things do. Of course, it all works together as a whole. But that has to happen. And so there was some of that also occurred. And then what also got a little bit weird, I think, on the tax regulations was, what if so-and-so fixes a bug and they're over there and we're over here? What does that mean? And so I think they basically decided on like bug fixing, all that kind of stuff, that it's still the ownership of the group that owns that project, right? And so if this under InnerSource is the ownership of because there's still always got to be, like, when we talked about the structures, there's still always that group of trusted committers, that group that's making those decisions is, does this feature belong here? Do we do this feature here? Things of that nature. And by going through and having that, you can kind of partition out better where it actually goes, financially speaking, for those reasons. And there were sometimes the decision was made of, oh no, it doesn't go here, it goes over here. Like, for example, working on my project with the orchestration, database as a service, even though the code came over and was part of the orchestration tool, it was still very much so owned by the database business unit. And so it's like, this is still their business unit. It's just that maybe this code resides over here on our code base, but it's still theirs. And so there was some differentiations like that ended up happening, so that it was easier to sit there and tell that. The times that it got weirder was on things with like other almost completely separate business units, like say Braintree or Venmo or things of that nature. And so one of the things that we did there was we allowed them to keep all of their same tools, right? So they're all still using their exact same tool set that they had when we purchased them. So like they're using Bitbucket or they're using, something else. But then what we asked for them to do is to replicate through the API over into like the enterprise search, so that everybody could sit there and see what was going on. And then once they knew what was going on, they could pop over to them and say, hey, we noticed your currency tool. We've got these currency tools over here that are doing this and this and this. Can we work together with you for a little bit to make sure that our currency tool and your currency tool are going to, mesh together correctly? And so they would do something like that. And that way, and then what happened is the person who found it would go over and temporarily like get permissions on their Bitbucket or whatever to sit there and work with them on the code and do those code changes. But I think it still went under their business, not under the other ones. And what happened is they just sat there and said, oh, we did some work over here, but it was still owned over there. So because that's where the trusted committers are, that's where all the people making their decisions are. And so it was actually fairly clear, I think, on the tax purposes for that, because of the fact that this is where the income is being generated. This group is helping fix things, but it's still being generated over here. And so it was a little bit clearer. It is difficult for sometimes, I think you really do have to have a corporate thing where you do understand what goes under that one team moniker. And so that those managers weren't penalized for helping another, business unit. Instead, it's like seen as, oh no, this was a collaboration. The taxes come from there, but we still helped over here. So the employee and their manager were still, recognized for their work and recognized for the work that really helps the company for doing. But it still wasn't penalized against it. And I did some interesting work with some of those people, talking about how to calculate what things are worth. I did that actually also for the open source projects as well, where there were some different metrics where you could go by to sit there and say, how many hours did you spend on it? How many hours would this have taken? How many hours does this team have? And so we went through and did some different mechanics to determine, what that was worth financially to the company that we did that. But for the most part, since it all went under collaborations, it wasn't, we didn't have a problem with the taxing aspects of that because it was still very clear who owned what, because the team who owned it is where it went under. Though I could sit there and see where if you weren't doing good modularization and componentization of code with interoperability, it could get very problematic. But once again, for a lot of that stuff, I feel like that's often my job because of where I come from in regards to my background for doing large scale systems architecture, that I'm always trying to help people componentize and create modules and do a good API and, figure out what that structure is going to look like so that it could be, have clarity in regards to ownership. Does that help?
Yeah, actually amazing. Thank you. Yeah, some of your insights solve our question actually, I think. Thanks. So, どなたか他に気になる質問がある方はいらっしゃいますでしょうか？マス金子さん、何かあります？ Software architecture matters for InnerSource.
It really does, Mass. I can't stress that enough. I think that's one of the beautiful things that open source has been giving us, right? Is understanding doing things like infrastructure as code and containerization and CI/CD and all of these different tools. I mean, like, GitHub itself, that's how all of those things, evolved, is by sitting there going, oh, how can we collaborate better? To do that. And I think that helps for the companies too. I think that's the big lesson for us to always take away from this, is that when we learn how to work openly with one another and collaborate well, that affects our architecture. We have to create our architecture structures to evolve with that. And that's the thing that I feel like can go back and forth a lot of times. So I totally agree with that, Mass. I think sometimes the problems. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
I think sometimes the problems that we have has to do with the fact that our organizational hierarchical structures don't always reflect correctly for the software architectural structures that we create.
Yeah, so microservices and maybe more modularization are connected to the idea of InnerSource.
Yep. Yeah, I think it helps a lot. And I think it can help with those accounting practices as well. If you do understand the modularization and you do understand each of those different pieces, it really can translate back over in regards to the budgeting and accounting processes, where you can have it more clearly defined who owns the thing. Because in the end, people still have to make decisions on these things. Right? You still have to make the budgetary call as to, do we need this feature? Do we need this stuff? Where does this go? And hopefully, if you can work with the organization, it can make it better. And I think it can make the business better.
Yeah. Thanks. Mm-hmm. Does anyone have another question?
I have a question.
Sure.
So how was it translating this? Because of the fact that I do have so many funny little examples. And,
Ah,
I know that I create, like I did that, too long didn't read at the very beginning, which I did on purpose for dealing with bosses, honestly. I created that so that you could basically tell your boss, here's the thing, and then if they don't completely understand it, here's the story. But I'm just like curious as to how that was like with, dealing with all of my
yeah. Or yeah, we had some program on translating specific words actually. For instance, the a big cheese program or maybe big cheese stories, and we all didn't understand what it was actually for the first time. So when gradually we knew the concept of uh, yeah, big cheese stories, and then
Yeah, yeah. That's actually Denise's, by the way. The big cheese is originally Denise's thing. So yeah, no, that's funny. That's cool. But it does has a lot to do with the whole hierarchical structure, though.
yeah. Mass commented it's like a Conway's role on a maybe architectural part of our discussion, maybe. Yeah. So when it comes to the InnerSource Commons or maybe your career, you experienced so many things like IEEE, remember Hyperledger, and then InnerSource Commons backwards actually. So what led you to the career like this? I mean, why
My
you started IEEE SA Open, and how different was from the InnerSource Commons and maybe InnerSource idea? Both
Yeah.
are kind of similar when it comes to contribution, but yeah, it's IEEE Open, SA Open is more of open source stuff, right?
Mhm.
Communication.
Yeah, it is, but it's also with standards, which isn't very open. So, or there's open standards, but it's not open standards is not what we're used to in regards to open source. It just means open standards was a term that was created quite some time ago, and it had to do with the fact that it opened up the standard to everyone can participate. It did not mean that the standard was free.
Mhm.
So there was a lot of different, and it's also interesting with IEEE with the whole academia focus, right? Because they've been around for 140 years, publishing scientific papers. They have some of like Nikolai Tesla's original papers, but still going through the traditional publishing model. Which is kind of funny because like how I got involved in open source in the first place was in the early 2000s. I'd been using open source for quite some time. In fact, I ran my own ISP in the mid 90s using Linux and did a bunch of work on that. But I didn't become a contributor or a participant, more accurately, until the early 2000s. And the reason for that was because I started doing a bunch of work in regards to open government. And I realized that the only way to have balance was to do things, in an open and transparent fashion. And so that's when I like really went into open source, wholeheartedly. I actually helped several different companies transition from proprietary source to open source. And so for a lot of that, it was going through the business evaluation of doing it. In fact, out of those four companies, there was four that hired me that sat there and wanted me to do it. On one of them, I told them actually not to go open source. Instead, I focused them on an open API model and how to go through and do their work that way. And the other three, I did actually help them transition into actual open source. But the other one, I didn't think that they had the ability or resources to do that correctly. And so as a business model, I sat there and I said, I don't think this will work for you, but I think this will. And I helped them do that instead. And so that's kind of my background in regards to that, is doing a lot of that different work. And one of the things that I kind of came in wholeheartedly on was open data. Because that's more of my background. I started doing a lot of database work in '89 with DBase 3 Plus. So lots of data work And my mom's a scientist. She's actually a fairly well-known scientist and was actually friends with y'all's previous prime minister. Uh, so she's got over 42,000 citations on Google Scholar. And so she very much so, we talked a lot about science, of course, growing up. And that's where the whole concept of citability came from, was having all that data there so that that way you could reproduce and sit there and see if things are good and if they're accurate. And so that's where a lot of my stuff all comes from. And that's one reason why I feel like I can talk about the AI work, because I have done some AI work in the past. It's different than the LLMs. I know Jeremy Howard, but and I watched some of this evolving. But I like my citations. I like being able to trace where everything comes from and things of that nature. So I kind of have a different perspective sometimes on AI than some of the current models that are evolving. But yeah, that's kind of how I got here, was from doing a lot of that. And then how I got involved in InnerSource was honestly Denise coming to me, and I was like, yeah, I was unsure about it, because I was like, this feels a little weird. I said, am I just like going to be teaching these corporations how to do this and then they're not going to contribute back? I'm like, that seems like a little yucky. I don't like that. And she's like, no, she's like, imagine if you can train all these engineers to do the right thing, and the companies, what all these different processes are. And then when it is time for them to do open source, they'll know what they're doing. And I was like, oh, you're right. That is a great way of looking at it, where it is like taking open, it's not it's not stealing from open source, it's instead working with open source. And like I said, I brought a lot of learnings from PayPal back into the open source world. And I feel like that kind of thing can continue to grow in that direction. I do worry a little bit about, where open source is going to go next, because I'm watching what's happening in Europe, and I'm watching what's happening with AI. And, I am concerned about, data privacy and things of that nature, and the fact that, things aren't being cited and things, because that's one of the things I love about open source, right? Is your ability to sit there and say, I did this, I worked on these things, and you can get pretty granular, you know, and I'm like, and it's the same thing with InnerSource. If InnerSource is done well, right, you can sit there in the company and go, no, I fixed this bug over here. It's not my team, but I did it. And see, and that's useful, and it encourages this whole other way of looking at things, where it's not just about, because right now I feel like the reason we have silos is because, like I said, with the whole Dunbar's number of communication issues, but it's also because we're so into specialization that we don't always break out and look larger. And we really need to do that. And so by doing InnerSource across the company, you can look larger at the company, and you can come up with all of these other different innovations. And that's something that I'm always going to be into. I'm a creative person. I like, reaching out and doing all of those different things. I think it's very important. So, yeah.
You mentioned that your background is data sharing, or maybe open data. But in
Yes.
addition to InnerSource, internal data sharing is another important thing, because data will be a competitive advantages in the age of AI. So what do you think about this?
Oh, no, I completely agree. I mean, that's why I did the enterprise search stuff at PayPal, is because I do think that is huge. That is the next thing that we need to look at. And because you can't create these AI models without the data, right? It all starts with the data. And so we need to make sure that we actually have that there. And the problem is with corporations, and I think, like I said, you're going to see this a lot with AI. A bunch of corporations have already started banning using it, right? Because they're like, we don't want you accidentally giving things out. In fact, Oracle, I believe, has banned, have blocked it. There's a bunch of other companies that came out with company policies saying you are not allowed to use it. A bunch of the gaming companies sat there and said, once again, no AI generated art, because we don't know what's going to happen in regards to copyright. because some judges ruled that images generated with AI cannot be copyrighted. And so a bunch of gaming companies are like, yeah, so no AI generated art. And I think there's going to be more stuff like that happens. And so, but at the same time, you don't want to be handicapped by that, right? If you're a business. So if you don't come in and create your own and figure out what that's going to look like, you will be at a disadvantage. Like I said, the tools are, they're too productive, honestly. They're too productive to not figure out how to use them correctly and safely. That companies will be forced to do that. And so I think, looking at those data, those data policies is going to be extremely important. And I think you're going to watch some governments, especially out of the EU, coming up with some of that. IEEE has this 7,000 standards series, which if you go to ethicsanddesign.ieee.org, you can see it. And one of those, the ethical AI one, was just cited in the European Commission's paper on AI, because of the fact that they are looking at how do we create these generalized rules on this so that we can create some standards and policies without inhibiting the creativity aspects of it as well. So I think there's a lot that's going to be happening there. And so I think in regards to InnerSource and data and doing things like enterprise search and all those different cross collaborations, you're going to need to have these things in place. You're going to need to have something like your own enterprise search and your own data sets for that, so that you can actually add your own learning models on top of a style of like OpenAI, and create your own tooling.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks so much. So now it's time to end our session with that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you for participating. And thank you again, Silona. Enjoy Singapore and of course Asia.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I hope to come back to Japan sometime soon.
Sure.
My stepson loves Japan. He normally doesn't like traveling that much. He doesn't like and he just adored Japan. He loved the train system and how he's on the spectrum, and he loved how organized it was. And then of course how everything was quiet and people weren't loud and noisy and things of that nature. It was just a delight. It was just so have to figure out a way for me to come back over and visit.
Yeah. Then InnerSource Commons community member can be your guide for Japanese travel, maybe.
Awesome. Or we could have an in-person meeting.
Sure.
So, though we won't have the translations going by, that might be a little harder.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, anyways. Yeah, I do appreciate your help always on InnerSource Commons and also for the Japanese community. And then, yeah, I hope you come to Japan in the future, maybe soon.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, have you again. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, have a great night.
Thank you.
Again, enjoy Force Asia.